Okay, I'm the last. Stop talking in the middle, and because I got asleep, but maybe not. Or I excuse you if you get asleep for the same reason. I'm really happy to be here for this unique conference from solar physics to exoplanets. This is really unique, never existed before, and thanks to Michael. And I also want to thank Michael for always supporting me, for balancing between exoplanets and solar physics with some stellar physics involved, of course. Because whenever we met, we always talk about both, and that is really encouraging. So today I'm talking about coolest sun, and I will connect to exoplanets. And you will see that there is physics which is involved in both the physics of the sun and physics of exoplanets, which I'm working a lot. And there is something to learn from exoplanets about the sun. So I'll try to show that. And I do hope that each of you here in the audience feel lucky. Lucky because we're here, we are alive, we were born despite all the troubles the humanity had, despite all the mass extinctions on the Earth. And we live on a beautiful planet, which is like a Goldilocks planet, which is not too hot and not too cold, and it's just right for us to be here and enjoy the life. And I think that we're also lucky to have such a good star as the sun, because it's also not too hot and not too cold, and it's just right. And it's not too old and not too young, because it's just right for us to be here. And that connection, I think, is very important for us, that there is these two beautiful objects and just right for us. And I just list here a couple of outstanding issues which connect Sun and Earth, and us studying them both through radiation mostly, and magnetic fields. And yes, the Sun is the forever frontier. It's not just new one, it's forever frontier, the same as space. And with the new kids in the town, and some of them really big, like deduced, there is a lot of exciting things to do and new things for the sun. And I will walk you through my ideas and my research for the last 20 years. And I'll show you how these 20 years were spent for developing new techniques, which now with the KIST and the most new instrumentation on other telescopes can be achieved. And well, we are all puzzled about magnetic convection, and here is a snapshot of a simulation zoomed to the dimensions to compare with the spatial resolution of the KIST, this 20 kilometers squared finest scale we can achieve, and as compared to the simulations. And we usually look at those simulations at large images and also observations, but now we have to be really microscopic, as Wolfgang said. It's really microscope for magnetic convection on the sun, and we will see more than in this simulation, hopefully. And this is on the horizontal scale. But if we look also into the vertical scale, then the complexity of the magnetic fields is enormous under the surface. And that's, I think this is a challenge for the new instrumentation and new research on the sun to achieve that resolution observationally on the horizontal space, but theoretically and through data analysis on the vertical space as well. And these are the examples of a small-scale magnetic fields with extremely entangled magnetic field below the not surface, but within the atmosphere and below it. So the horizontal line is tau equal 1. So within the atmosphere, it's very complex still. So, and I do think that many of you guessed that I will talk about molecules, and it is true. Yes, 20 years spent to develop molecular diagnostics to study solar magnetic fields. And here's the plan. Yes, we do have, or will have, very high cadence observations in molecular band with using imaging, and we do now develop broadband polarimetry in multiple filters at Gregor telescope in molecular bands, and high resolution spectropolarimetry is, of course, is always there. We need, for data analysis, inversions, and which becomes more and more complicated and involved. So we need machine learning techniques to accelerate them and do massive inversions. I will show you examples of stochastic thermodynamics analysis, which is also bringing new results from the data we receive with the new instruments. And what is important is to include as many non-NLTE effects as possible with the physics we know. And my point today is to show you that scattering is very important physics, which we should include when we study cool solar plasma. The results is that, as I emphasized, we get 3D thermal and magnetic structures with a high resolution, and also time evolution and fluctuations of these structures. I do inspire for temperature minimum studies and the low chromosphere restructure using the molecular spectroscopy. And that should provide some feedback to the MHD simulations of the cool solar atmosphere structures and improve solar UV radiation computations, which are important, again, for Earth climate development simulations and computations. Well, we start from quiet sun, and this is the work was done by my student in 2010 using the simulations from 2009. Could be redone for the new simulations, but interesting thing is here that simulations were, so the observables were, these images were computed from simulations in molecular bands at different wavelengths, mostly near UV and also CO infrared bands not shown here. The idea was to see whether temperature, whether we can use these simulations for temperature calibration of our data, and whether there is any dependence on the temperature, of contrast on the temperature, and we can use this information for getting the information with the height, because these molecular bands are formed at different heights. And that was in preparation for also Sunrise mission, Sunrise 1, and later that was some of these observations were done with Sunrise and compared with the Continuum observations and the optical, and it was the high contrast of small-scale magnetic fields was achieved in molecular bands, and Sami was talking about this, and this is just a snapshot of this molecular band observations compared to simulations as well. We did analyze the Sunrise 1 and Sunrise 2 data with the stochastic thermodynamic techniques developed by my students, Andrei Gorobets, in these 3 papers. And interesting thing is that we do learn new things when we, of course, apply new techniques. And here we achieved a fact that we could characterize quantitatively evolutionary processes of the small-scale magnetic fields. And we could measure the complexity through this technique, like produce the numbers characterizing the complexity evolution process, and this is done through entropy production measure. So I will not explain much of this, but if you're interested, you can look into papers. The interesting thing is that this theory was developed for small-scale turbulence in the lab. It was measured in the lab and was confirmed. All this fluctuation theory, for instance, was first theoretically suggested and measured in the lab on a small-scale turbulence. Now we show that the turbulence on the sun with the convective cells of 1,000 kilometers actually obey the same law as a turbulence in the lab. That was pretty spectacular. In Sunspot, we made similar simulations or synthesis of images from MHD simulations, again 2009, Matthias Rempel work. We've taken a very, just a strip of the simulations, which includes umbra, penumbra, and a little bit of a quiet sun, and made the same molecular bands. I show only titanium oxide here, which was very interesting to see that titanium oxide contrast or brightness features in titanium oxide depend very nicely on the temperature, and that calibration would work for darker regions on the sunspot like umbra and also in the photosphere. And we've seen example of measurements of the quiet sun in titanium oxide band. It's a continuum in the quiet sun, and then it goes into umbra. It becomes a strong molecular band, and that works actually as a good signature of the measure of the temperature. So these are examples of this imaging in titanium. Yet another example of titanium oxide imaging of the solar magnetic fields. And the first one we have done in 2003 at SST. Studying the results was very interesting. There was a risky observations, but the risk paid off. The result was interesting that we did see some interesting structures, complex structures in the light bridge in umbra. And the later observations of sunspot umbra revealed very complex structure, which is still to be reproduced by simulations. And that is, again, as the telescope gets bigger, this information overwhelms the theory. So here I zoom to simulations and observations, and I actually write down this, that on the left you have simulations and on the right you have observations, and they are very comparable in the quality and in resolution. This is current status of both, but I do show this resolution of the decreased element now at this wavelength 30 by 30 kilometers, and we do hope that using the same filter at decreased, we will start seeing much smaller structures and very interesting evolutions here. I would like to again emphasize that achieving 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers resolution in height is the main challenge right now. And as we develop the techniques, observational facilities for getting it on the surface, this resolution. And here molecules are extremely valuable again. Here is example from 2003 paper, formation heights of titanium oxide. It's the same band as we used for imaging shown before. And magnesium hydride lines, which I will show also several examples later. They have so magnesium hydride lines, distance between peaks of formation of different lines is less than 20 kilometers. So if we select lines which are covering this range of depth and a fine selection of the depths, then by doing inversions of these lines, we can disentangle this, of course, convoluted contribution function, which covers such a large range of heights with a very high precision. So that would be a challenge, I guess, for DKIST, and there is a nice instrument which is built here at HAO, WISP, which will allow to do such research. Because then you really need many lines and many wavelengths for that. Yeah? Contribution function is the integrand which you integrate to get intensity of a flux. So yeah. Yeah, these are different lines. So spectral lines. Yeah, spectral lines. Yeah, sorry, I didn't. I thought I implied that it's obvious. Sorry. Yes, these are different spectral lines at different wavelengths. So when you use several lines, you really cover the depth. And when you use one atomic line, you basically, one or two, you get this line here like this and another line like this. And molecules, because there's so many, you get like really, really fine grid of depths there. And that's the hope. And that is a challenge to do inversions on so many lines. But it's also, we finally get really, deduced is the really first, I mean, Sami argues that Sunrise was the first real multi-wavelength telescope, but deduced now has not 3 cameras, but has like, I don't know, 12 cameras to do these different spectral ranges, yeah. And that is a combination of Sunrise and deduced would be unique, yes, definitely. So these are examples, again, of polarization measurements in those bands, which I showed you before. And titanium oxide has a very nice magnetic sensitivity, not only temperature sensitivity, as shown before, but also magnetic. So the umbral structures can be measured, magnetic structures and brightness can be measured with this band very nicely. Magnesium hydride, shown here below, is also interesting. It's in Paschenbach regime. And there's some theoretical complications, but we solve those problems. And you can see, for instance, if you compare blue and red profiles, they are opposite sign. These are opposite sign Landau factors. And these are really interesting features of molecular lines. They are half of them positive and half of them negative Landau factors. And that is extremely useful for inversions and for also calibration of a crosstalk of your instruments. This is one of the really first examples when inversions of atomic and molecular lines were carried out in the infrared. Here it's nicely shown that atomic and molecular lines are formed at really different heights. And when you include both into inversions, you expand your range of heights by a factor of 2. And then you get magnetic fields and temperature structures there. This is example of Hinode spectral region and comparison of umbral dots and dark umbra. They do have really different spectra and polarization signals. So in the diffuse dark umbra, you can see a lot of molecular lines blending the atomic lines, while in the umbral dots and in penumbra, you see kind of nice atomic spectral signatures. So when you include, again, these molecular lines into inversions, you get a height, different height information. And that was done for umbra here, this inversions of one of the first spot observed by the Hinode with the height for the magnetic fields and the temperature. So with deduced, we can do this with a higher spatial resolution again. And this is, again, example of for crosstalk calibration with molecules. This is in the near-infrared WH lines, similar to those which are at 1.56. There are plenty of them, around 1.5 micron. Those pairs also have opposite Landau factors. They form at the same height, and they can be used for crosstalk calibration. So that was a paper in 2003 yet, how to calibrate ATST at that time. So, and now we come to scattering, which is now one of my favorite subjects as well. Scattering in molecular lines was puzzling a problem discovered by simple observations by Stanfield and Keller in early 2000s. And I got involved through molecules, of course. Jan just approached me and said, well, you study molecules, Lyman effect in molecules, why don't you do Hanle effect and scattering? So I studied Jan's book and come up with solution. And its solution is very simple because there is a Rayleigh scattering and the molecules are very efficient scatterers. And this is exactly the same magnesium hydride band which I showed you before, which is useful for sunspot. It's also useful for studying limb polarization of the sun. And polarization is larger at the limb because of the 90-degree scattering. And near the limb, we measure, see very nicely molecular polarization standing out in polarization, but barely seen in the intensity where the atomic lines dominate. So this is a very also good tool to study scattering polarization. And why do we need this? Because we can see magnetic fields which are not visible by Zeeman effect. So here we use Hanle effect to integrate over the patch of the solar surface with very entangled magnetic fields, which we call turbulent magnetic field. These are mixed polarity, spatially unresolved fields. So when you integrate over such patch, you see no Zeeman effect, basically, but unless you have some slight, or you have really residual Zeeman effect, very depends on the accuracy you use. So from this patch, you will have some little bit residual, but you will never know actually what is the magnetic field, because you will measure only magnetic flux. And so here, this example, very nice example we found in the whole optical spectrum of the molecular carbon lines, which are affected by weak magnetic field through scattering. So this is a scattering polarization measured on the limb. And this line has a Landé factor of 10 smaller than these two lines. And so these lines react to the magnetic field, and this one is not at this regime. And that fact is used as a differential Hanle effect. And it really shows this change of the relative scattered polarization is the signature of that turbulent magnetic field. And by change of the amplitude, we can say how much is that. And the hope is that this is, of course, you can see that polarization is 0.1%, so it means 10 to minus 3. Well, that's a challenge to measure, but it's still possible. So this is done. This work is done with the SIMPL instrument, and we have the SIMPL at Gregor right now, and we do hope that maybe second generation instruments at DKIST will have something similar to SIMPL, and this polarization can be measured. So now I would like to show you examples that why exoplanets have something to do with the sun. So here it's all blue, and I hope you're guessing that it's all about Rayleigh scattering. So why sky is blue on the Earth? It's Rayleigh scattering. Why one of those exoplanets happen to be blue is because of Rayleigh scattering. And I put the sun in the blue here. It's because that if you look at the sun in the blue, you will see a lot of Rayleigh scattering. So I showed you in molecular lines. Now it is in the continuum. In the continuum, this is the Jan Stenslow paper, 2005. He deduced continuum polarization from so-called second solar spectrum, recorded with SIMPL on different telescopes, including MACMAF. That continuum polarization reaching 1% at between 300 and 400 nanometers, like 320 nanometers approximately, the maximum. That is caused by Rayleigh scattering on neutral hydrogen Lyman series, basically. So that's the wing of Lyman alpha dominates here, basically, in this profile. And the level of this continuum polarization is unknown with a high accuracy. As you see, there is some scatter here because it's very hard to measure, because everything we measure on the sun is a relative polarization to the continuum. And the continuum is adjusted by, I mean, for Zeeman measurements, it doesn't matter what is the continuum polarization. But for Hanle measurements, it's very important. What is the absolute level of the polarization? Because then your Hanle data, your magnetic field, usually it's done with the model, but measuring it's very important. Okay, so, and where this continuum polarization is important in terms of the surface structures, that is what I was investigating recently, and this is some preliminary result of that. What is shown here is that scattering opacity exceeds absorption in higher layers of the atmosphere, and the cooler atmosphere, the larger scattering polarization. And the deeper this crossover with absorption opacity happens. So these are the examples on the right shown for stellar atmospheres of different temperatures. And you see that for the sun, the scattering opacity, solar temperature, this 5,800 Kelvin as a green line, happens in very high layers, approximately near the temperature minimum, like maybe slightly above it. And as you go to cool atmospheres, this crossover moves deeper to the atmosphere, and we achieve fully scattered atmosphere at very low temperatures, like 2,500. This 2,500 is already temperature of hot Jupiters. So the atmospheres of hot Jupiters are really scattering dominated. And here the plot shown for this one. This is the plot for the same simulations I used before. This is a scattering opacity depending with the height, showing with some magnetic structures, like shown in the bottom. That's magnetic field small scale structures, and you can see that it's not only where the cooler that scattering dominates, but also where the magnetic field present on the sun. And that seems to have because of the lower density in those magnetic features, despite the temperature could be not so cool. So in hot Jupiters, this to explain the high polarization of that hot Jupiter we detected, I made calculations of irradiation of the atmosphere, and calculated contribution of scattering contribution and absorption from different sources in the continuum. And I also don't want to explain everything here, but here shown a source function, okay, with a pointer. So this is the top plots, our source function curves, and the black one is the thermal source function. So this is a Planck, basically, depending on temperature. And the magenta and the green, these are the scattering source function. Green is a single scattered photons, and magenta is multiple scattered photons. So as we go to the upper atmosphere, when this above this crossover of the absorption and scattering, the atmosphere becomes fully scattering, basically here. And many of photons are singly scattered photons, because the density of this atmosphere is very low. And this becomes even more dramatic. So this is the less dramatic when the distance between star and the planet is larger, and it's more dramatic when you bring the planet closer to the star. So this 5 times closer. And the result of this source function interplay is that you can get much higher polarization when the atmosphere of the planet is highly irradiated, and you can also get limb brightening of this atmosphere. So keeping this in mind, we can look at the solar atmosphere. So here, this is solar atmosphere. One of the models I have taken from this simulation, it's approximately in the middle of this magnetic element. Here, this 2 examples where irradiation is not that big and a little bigger, just to show that what happens when you increase irradiation of that particular model is that you increase single scattered photons. So that's the same effect as we saw in the hot Jupiter. And you move deeper into the atmosphere for this crossover. So that these two both effects result in the fact that you increase the polarization. So at the limb you get very high polarization, and the limb darkening also changes a little bit. We don't see really limb brightening here, but the polarization increases. Why this is interesting is that during the explosive events, one can try to detect the higher polarization in the like during the flares, for instance, so in the low atmosphere. And that would be, I mean, first of all, this is changing of the radiation picture of the atmosphere, so it will affect this whole entire spectrum. And the second, I'm personally interested in polarization. The polarization appearance of the highly polarized light during that event would actually indicate that this irradiation was changing the situation in the atmosphere. And what happens during these irradiations is that, of course, as I showed, the scattering increases, but also that irradiation changes the chemical composition of the atmosphere through photodissociation, because these are near UV photons scattered from hot plasma radiated at short wavelengths. And it was shown by Fontenla in 2015 that photodissociation of the simple molecules, which I showed you also some of them before, is responsible for UV opacities which were not accounted in the solar modeling before. So that is quite interesting. First of all, this photodissociation has to be counted for just normal solar models, but if we have also irradiation from the top atmosphere of the cool plasma or within the magnetic elements, that photodissociation also will play the role effect on the chemical composition of that layer. And that the layer is the one which is near temperature minimum and also a little bit above it. So this is shown, this is the number densities of molecules in the solar atmosphere, the same snapshot. And you can see that basically the zero height is a tau 0 at 500 nanometers. So the whole atmosphere is filled with molecules, but some of them go above the temperature minimum here. For instance, CO. CO number densities are pretty high here in the low atmosphere, and it's inhomogeneous. So when such atmosphere is irradiated by hot radiation from hot plasma, you have two processes here. First of all, some molecules will be destroyed, so there will be some kind of erosion of this layer through the radiative decay, and there will be scattering events with increased polarization. I was inspired very much by the talk, previous talk from Interstellar, from the star formation region. I actually was tempted to put a picture here of proplids, because that would be something similar, very, very similar, just different time scale. Proplids are formed at whatever, millions years, here would be seconds or milliseconds. And so the thing is that it's possible that if you take the CO level, for instance, yeah, and you irradiate it with the explosive event, then you erode first, of course, those, you will, okay, I point here. You will erode around these bumps here and maybe eat in a little bit here. So you will create this kind of CO clouds, which we know exist in the atmosphere. And that would be a very dynamic process because these explosive events are, of course, not lasting very long. So here's the slide which you asked for. These are CO clouds detected by Tom Maris and his colleagues. And that would be very interesting to study the process, how these clouds are formed. So my idea is that we have to look at the polarization. If we see increase of polarization during these events, we know that, and the CO clouds forming kind of, then we know this is due to irradiation. So this is kind of ideas that we can investigate. Also interesting thing is that these CO clouds, again, analogy to proplyds. See, if you look outside, they're pretty bright and hot because the hydrogen is ionized on surface of the proplyds. But inside, they're pretty cold. And the CO dominated and H2 dominated because they're just cold inside. And the CO clouds, they may have also H2 and H2O molecules inside. They should be dense because, again, it's a shock. So you increase density by this radiation and the shocks, and H2O could be forming also there. And we know there is H2 water on the sun. So we know water exists everywhere, even on the sun. And we should look at water formation, actually. And that will be very interesting. Again, accessible, should be accessible with deKIST. It's have to look where exactly, but there is at this range between 1 and 5 microns, there are water molecules there. And so that's the idea. So it's exciting time, and here's my conclusions, that structure and dynamics of cool regions on the sun is best investigated with the help of molecules. We, by using molecular lines forming at very fine grade of different heights, we can achieve resolution of 20 kilometers with the depth, not only with the surface resolution. Solar neo-UV flux is affected by scattering and molecular photodissociation in cool regions and magnetic regions as well. And I think that irradiation of the low atmosphere and the, meaning like low chromosphere and the temperature minimum should be included into solar models. And then I'm sure we will discover in simulations, we will discover some effects which we cannot explain yet in observations. So that's what my vision of this theory development. Thank you very much.